1, 2, 1, 2. Oh, 1, 2, 1, 2. Hello, everyone. My name is Frederick. I'm CEO of EDO, and we're a small design studio focused on UX, UI, and design systems. We typically help B2B startups, growth companies, established companies too, but we have a tendency to focus a bit more on startups and growth companies because there's so many good things that we can help them with. That is also what we're going to talk a bit about today, because the title of the webinar is Happier Users, Healthier Business. And there's many layers to that. And the main thing, I think, underlying of that title is strategically, we want to look at UX. We want to look at UX from a commercial angle. We want to see what can UX do besides the aesthetics, besides the feel, besides the user flows, all the typical things designers look at. We want to dig a bit deeper. And for me, the title, Happier Users, Healthier Business, works very well. When we have happier users, meaning we have customers who loves using our product, our software product, who loves paying for that service, using that at work, using that private life, it typically means that we also have a healthy business in terms of revenue, in terms of cash flow, in terms of specific things that relate to a healthy business for you. Now, I'm going to focus a lot on startups and growth companies because this is where we can make a big difference, but it applies, generally speaking, to any part of your journey as a software company. So the webinar goal, let's start with that. I don't want to push too hard on the UX front. I think that the main thing, I would be very happy if I just made you more mindful, more aware of UX design in general and the power it has to drive any sort of growth in your startup company. So I'm going to try and make it very tangible and trying to translate strategic and commercial benefits throughout this webinar today. And I'm going to do that through these 6 bullets. It looks like a lot. It's not. I've distilled it. I'm trying to be very direct and short-headed in terms of all these topics. But these are all topics that I care a lot about and that we care a lot about here at EDO. And we think are very important, especially for startups and growth companies, because this, again, I'm going to repeat myself a lot of times saying this, but this is where we can really make a big difference quite easily early on when we're trying to acquire new users to the platform. It says 45 minutes at the top. We'll see how long it takes. I can talk about this for a long time, so I'm trying to limit myself, but also we have a Q&A at the end, which we usually do. But if you have any questions along the way, if you're listening live, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot them in the message box somewhere, and Philippe and Stephanie will read them aloud for me as we go along, so we don't have to have a look at all the questions at the end. So again, feel free to shoot us a message at any given time throughout the webinar. We'll try to respond to it in the context. So breaking down the 6 bullets, just quickly, the first thing we're going to talk about is not so much about actual UX practice, but it's more about why your competitors and why UX in general is very difficult. I think it's, in terms of the competitor bit, it's very interesting to look at why your competitors are not doing it. Simply because that means that you have a potential benefit in a maybe very crowded market where market share is not hanging on the trees, and that will give you an edge, especially if you're a startup trying to disrupt a conservative industry, for example. Being very focused on something your competitors are not should give you some sort of competitive advantage. We're going to talk about the nice to have mentality around UX and design in general, but more focused on UX, and trying to talk a bit about some misconceptions about UX, but also try and give you a sort of the right track, like what can this thing actually do for you. And we're going to round that off with a few Danish examples, close to home examples in bullet 3 of well-known companies that you all know and that have been very successful and have had this very UX first, very consumer-driven approach to building their product, again, in a very hard market that they're in. In bullet 4, we're going to talk a bit about the opposite side of happy users, which is, of course, frustrated users. I'm going to show you a few tangible examples of where a lot of tech companies might get it wrong, at least initially. In point 5, I'm going to guarantee you actually that we have a few areas that we focus a lot on in our daily work that we know is going to have a significant impact on your business, on the user satisfaction, on all the parameters that you might look at as a tech company when you're sitting in the boardroom, looking at all the metrics, writing down the goals for 2025. These are 3 areas that we would always recommend any of our clients and any startup in general to focus on, because these are guaranteed to drive some sort of revenue positively in your business. Lastly, I'm going to talk very shortly about something I talk about, I think, every time I talk in general about UX, which is including your users in some sort of way. And that can be through simple user feedback, it can be through user interviews, usability testing. There's a whole lot of things to talk about there. I'm going to keep it very short because it is quite interesting. Again, going back to the first point too, a lot of your competitors are not doing this thing. So that's it for the next 45 minutes. Let's dig into why your competitors are ignoring UX. Now, there's a few reasons, and I want to highlight 2 of them. One of them being, at least with maybe more inexperienced product teams or C-level, that have never actually tried to implement some sort of UX workflow in their companies. For them, marketing and sales, when we look at how we can scale our business, how we can get more users, how we can grow our revenue, marketing and sales are obviously great places to look, because we're all aware of it. We all know it. When we start our company, it's one of the first things we need to write down in our business plan. Like, how are we going to approach the market? How are we going to sell this thing we're trying to sell? And what is the message around it? What's the narrative? Now, UX design, in many ways, are kind of competing indirectly with these two groups, these two disciplines, because there is a budget associated with, let's say, hiring a marketing agency or hiring internal people. Same with sales. Maybe sales is even fairly inexpensive to get started with, because it might be related to the sales they do. So we're looking at UX as some sort of, we need to hire a completely new discipline. We're not too aware of what it does, and we're not really sure how to measure the success of this. We need to buy a laptop and a few licenses for different software, and also designers might not fit into whatever we're building. If we're building something really complex, we have to find the right expertise in this space, and they're not very cheap either. So comparing that to marketing and sales, when we look at growth, that is very difficult, obviously for UX, and that leads me also into UX in general as a expertise, as a service, as a discipline. There are two things that differentiates UX from marketing and sales, and that is very difficult. Marketing and sales is also very difficult, but more specifically, if we dig down a bit, it's very difficult to measure, it's very difficult to scale. And comparing that to something like marketing, where you are able to, let's say, if we focus on paid socials, pretty simple for you to test a bunch of things, get instant results, and then adjust. And take out of 10 creatives, out of 10 campaigns, you take the 3 best performing ones, you do that again and again and again, and then at the end, in most cases, hopefully, you'll end up with 5 campaigns that perform excellently, that drives consumers to your landing page, and hopefully they sign up and they start using your product or give you a call. That's great. It's easy to find that formula. It's not easy, it takes time, but it's fairly simple to have. When you have that formula, put more money into it and scale and grow if you have the money. That's the issue. Difficult to scale in terms of similar to what I just talked about. It's very difficult to plug this stick in. Like, you have this thing, now we just want to put power into it so we can grow our user base. Very difficult. If we look on the other side, measuring, also extremely time consuming. With the same thing with marketing, as I just mentioned, and sales too, we can record and figure out quite easily and track what is leading to this consumer reaching out, what is leading to these users joining our platform. Whereas with UX, we have a very tiresome process, and I've just very on a high level tried to visualize what goes into it. So usually a lot is done on gut feeling initially, especially in the startup days, where we don't have too much time to go out and validate and talk and do all these necessary things that we would recommend you to do. So we operate on gut feeling. That's fine. We design something, we develop it, we launch it. We get some sort of reaction, and then we fine tune. Now, fine tuning it might also happen on gut reaction. But in some instances, we usually want to do some sort of testing. We want to monitor the solution. We want to track the user journey. We want to see, where do we lose people? Where is the churn happening? Then we maybe want to redesign something based on that, after talking to a user, after kind of having a look at the general user journey, and then we need to test that new UI too. Now, once that's tested, we might want to go back and make sure it's the right thing we're building in terms of talking to the end user, the consumer who asked for this, and that is very time consuming too. Once all of that is done, we still need to develop it, we still need to launch it, and then depending on the amount of users you have using your product, we also need to wait for some sort of reaction or feedback. That process is very long-winded, and we might even, despite our best efforts, we might not even hit it correctly in the first try. And that's the downside of UX. It's very difficult to scale. It's very difficult to measure, especially when we compare it to our allies in marketing and sales, because there is some sort of formula, and people are usually quite used to this approach. If we look at the nice to have mentality, as I mentioned before, we have quite a few misconceptions about UX design, which I hear a lot when I'm out talking to people, to founders, general C-level people who are interested in this UX thing because they've heard a lot about it. Maybe they have some board members or an advisory board or colleagues who mention that this could be an actual viable way to go. Let's invest some money in UX design in general, for a platform to, for whatever reason, to scale, or to get more market share, or to just have more happier users. Now, a few misconceptions that I hear a lot is here on the left side, where UX is not really a driver of revenue, which is obviously, if it's not done correctly, that's very true. If not done correctly, it's just a very big investment into not too much. The reality, what we see, at least what we experience, is that being very heavy on the UX side and involving your users and meeting them where they are and understanding their issues, and then designing something based on what they actually need, also in bigger groups. So if you have 5 customers, instead of just listening to the one and building whatever they tell you, actually listening to all 5 of them and then finding one unified solution, that's usually the best way to go. That obviously creates loyalty. That usually creates some sort of upsell, because they might pay for you to build that. They might be interested in it once you've released it, and that might come with an additional fee, for example, just to be really practical. But essentially, if done right, this is a huge revenue booster in your organization, compared to, and sometimes even greater, depending on where you are in your journey, than marketing and sales. Aesthetics is usually misconceived with UX, like there's an equal sign in between, which is not usually the case. That's more of a user interface thing. But UX is just aesthetics, is something we hear. How the button looks, the rounded corners, the spacing, the sizing, the typography, all of this. All of that obviously leads to some sort of good user experience if done right. But we need to kind of step away from the aesthetics. We need to step away from the form and function, which is important. But UX in general is something that you should look at, as I just mentioned, on pair with sales, like hiring your first salesman, hiring your first marketing person. It's on the same level, it's on the same strategic level and importance as UX in general. So we need to move this very non-important like imagination we have of UX to a more serious level, essentially, is what I'm saying. And we see businesses who do that, and we see businesses who prosper because of it, because it's so essential. And I'll get back to that. Short-term fluff, long-term product value. We see it as we'll do it once, we'll just fix the things we've already built. Maybe we have a MVP, we have a version 1. Let's hire in a designer and let's have them fix it up, and we'll recode the front end, for example, and that's great. So it's a short-term fix to something that we've done earlier, whereas you should really mindfully present it or position it as a long-term product value, similar to a lot of the other things that you talk a lot about in your organization. Before we move on to some actual examples, I want to just visualize what we typically see. So we have the ideal version, not just according to me, but in general, there is some sort of consensus that you want your team to be split into a certain amount of pies, but also take up a certain amount of space in your team. Now, obviously, development is the most important thing if you're building some sort of software, and they're typically the ones who actually make sure that the user can get something out of it. Whereas we have marketing and sales too, which have a piece of the pie, obviously, we need them, but product also taking a bigger part of that pie. And in product, we have product owners, we have designers of different kinds, UX, UI, design system, whatever you need to drive your organization forward. But in reality, what we usually see is development taking a bit bigger piece of the pie, and usually also being in charge of the design, which for some developers might be very nice, but at least for the most developers I know, that's not the nicest part. They need to focus on what they're very, very good at, which is coding, which is developing scalable platforms. They need to be handed the blueprint to whatever they need to build, and they need to be able to think 2 steps ahead and build the right solution for you as a company as you grow too. Sales and marketing, for that reason, usually takes up a bigger piece of the whole pie, and that obviously differs. Sometimes the C-level people are also involved in these processes, so it doesn't necessarily mean that we're hiring a sales team or we're hiring a marketing person. It could also be agency related if you're getting your marketing services from outside, which is very common too. But that's what we usually see in reality when we talk to startups. If we look at the general gist of what I'm trying to communicate here in terms of nice to have and the misconceptions, if we start with having great UX, what we typically see is some sort of user satisfaction. For example, if that's a metric that's important to you, it should be, we see an improved user satisfaction, obviously, because a good intuitive experience is usually very, very nice. It doesn't matter if you're driving a car, operating your oven at home, or you're using some sort of technical product at your work. Word of mouth is one channel, which we typically hear that people, okay, we love this new thing, or we've switched to this from this old school thing, and it's just great. It just does a little less, but it does it very well. That usually turns into high retention, as in we have people and customers and companies staying for longer using a certain product because if they're happy, they usually stay. That should, if done right, commercially too, result in some sort of growth when we look at revenue, when we look at the bottom line, what you're earning, because UX is a continuous thing. It's not just something you do once and you let it go. It's a thing that keeps on improving your product. And that is, generally speaking, great for revenue, normally. Now, don't just take my word for it. I have, as I said, a few Danish examples, a few close to home examples. And these are great examples of companies that once were startups. You all know them, Pleo and Luna in what I would define as the fintech industry. Great examples of startups, once were startups, now big companies, way beyond Copenhagen at this point. And what they have in common is they're very tech first, they're very design first, they're end consumer first. And it can be quite difficult to kind of compare yourself to these huge successful stories. I know that. We could have brought a few cases of our own, but we feel like seeing it in companies like these, who's in some very interesting, very old school conservative markets, there is something to be learned from that. One of the examples here from one of the articles related to Luna, where they talk about, and they're advocating for this early investment in UX. And that's kind of what gave them an edge initially. They figured out, well, how does this industry look? What do they like? Well, apps are very common and very easy to get a hold of. We need a proper onboarding, and we needed to make it super easy for people to join us. And that, as they say here, led to faster user growth. Obviously, if you have a good onboarding, if it's easy for me on my couch to set up my account at home compared to signing up to some traditional bank, for example, that's obviously going to lead to some sort of growth. Improve retention too, because their user experience, their customer service, all the things around their experience is great. We stay, we love it. We stay for the good experience. And that ultimately leads to some sort of return of investment on the initial investment, the early investment they made in UX design. If we look at Pleo is quite different, still in fintech, but obviously focusing on some other things that they're trying to solve. Two things I want to highlight with this is, one of the things is intuitive design. They mentioned that, and that obviously gave them a place in the market, because a lot of companies are struggling with this, and there's a lot of old solutions that it's not very digital at that point, at least. Now, the thing I also want to focus on is the launch of the freemium model. Now, I'll get back to this, but thinking commercially around the UX too, like getting those two attached. So it's not just we think the commercial thoughts over here in this meeting room, and then we hand it over to the UX person to kind of figure it out. They need to be attached. They need to be closely attached, because we're able to say, let's create this freemium model. Let's have people get in, and at the right time, we're going to convert them into paying users when it makes sense. And that will obviously, if you have a great product, good onboarding, lead to a lot of signups in most cases, which is the case for Pleo 2. Very interesting cases. There's a lot to learn from those two cases too, even though they're huge at this point. If we dig into some of the classic UX mistakes that we see, I brought some statistics first of all, which of course doesn't necessarily apply completely to your use case, your situation, your journey, but in general, these are a nice sort of marks to have in the back of your mind, just simply because of the effect that UX can have. And in this case, we're looking at onboarding more specifically, where we see, and there are some links below to the actual research, but where we see a tendency for people to choose the software they're using based on the onboarding. Now, that's huge, especially if you're a startup, especially if you're trying to acquire users in a very saturated market where maybe there is some sort of big player sitting on most of the market share. There might be a bunch of smaller startups or growth companies trying to solve the same thing as you. If you can focus on getting this onboarding part right, you are golden in most cases. Around 60% thinks their onboarding is key to deciding if they want to subscribe to a product, which is huge. Subscribing, obviously, in most cases mean some sort of money, a subscription. Roughly around 74%, exactly 74%, say they're eager or willing to switch solutions simply based on the onboarding process being too complicated, meaning that if you're looking for a certain piece of software to solve a certain issue, it's just a Google search away. You'll find 3 competitors doing the exact same thing. And if one of the solutions is more difficult for you to get started and getting into the platform, that's going to be a bad time for you and your startup. Lastly, we have a bit about loyalty, but we also have a bit about continuous education, which obviously means that onboarding is not just in the initial phase, it's also next time you launch a new feature, or later on in the process, or when the main user's colleague is joining the platform. There are a lot of considerations to be taken in terms of onboarding, getting people engaged and retained in your product. I want to mention, I don't want to go dig too deep into this. I just want to mention it because you need to have it in your back of your mind too. Generally speaking, when we talk UX, and this becomes very theoretical too, but there are 7 principles that we usually try to design for and by, unknowingly sometimes, but generally speaking, you will recognize these patterns too when you're just using products in your daily life. There's something about discoverability. There's something about proper feedback if something is not working, or if you have to wait for something. A spinner, for example, you want that feedback. There's something about affordance, that you know that you can drag and drop something. There's something about signifiers saying you can click this and you should click this. And there's also something about constraints, meaning there are things that you can't do in the platform for maybe technical reasons. Let's communicate that to the end user. Look this up if you have the time and are interested in learning. These are very simple models that is generally a thing that will make your product better if you haven't considered them, if you haven't been mindful of them. Do a little audit of your own system afterwards. Right, coming to the good part now with the 3 areas for revenue increase. Now, one thing I like to focus a lot on, and I've been talking about this before, and I'll keep talking about it for the rest of my career, I think, is take a look at your funnel. Take a look at the customer journey. Take a look at where your ideal customer enters or gets to know you, and that could be in this fictional example, but still very real, related to one of the companies we work with. A LinkedIn ad, for example, can be the first trigger to get to your landing page, to continue through some sort of creation flow, and then end up being a returning daily user. Hopefully, if that's the case, if that's the goal for you. In some enterprise tools, obviously, you might just want to see them once every month, maybe once a year. It depends on your end goal. But for this example, returning daily is the ultimate goal. And that is usually, again, contributed to some sort of revenue increase, because that will mean they're paying for something. When we look at that 100% initially, and then we look at the, let's say, roughly 5% in the end, that's a huge waste of resources. And that's usually contributed to UX, poor UX, not considered UX, because the effort it takes, for example, if you're in a place where you have a marketing agency or internal people working for sales, the effort and resources you put into paying for, let's say, a LinkedIn ad in this example, is of course some sort of monetary value, but also the time that your people use, or the people you have outsourced your marketing to are using, is also worth something. So it's nice to take a step back and kind of realize the amount of effort we put up here is kind of lost because we're not really focusing on the key thing that people are coming for, right? We can sell this dream and we can sell the value proposition, but we also need a product that lives up to it. Now, one thing we can do to help us, step one, realizing what is our flow, realizing somewhat where are we losing people typically, and that process can be difficult, of course, but being somewhat mindful, and then figuring out exactly where you have this aha moment in your journey. Now, the aha moment is essentially when the light bulb flickers for your users, for your customers, and they realize that this is great. This is exactly what I need. This is what I came for. And this is essentially also the thing that's going to help me make me stay using this product because it provides me value. Now, this aha moment, if you don't know this currently, you need to figure that out right away. Like, when is it? In this case, it's when the budget is created for this fintech SaaS solution, because that is where I, as a company owner who want to see my budget after I've integrated with economics, got my numbers in there and signed up, that's what I want to see. What we want to do, essentially, simply put, is remove as much friction, as many touch points before the user gets that aha moment. The sooner we can move that aha moment to meet with the user who comes in through, let's say, a LinkedIn ad, is going to be great for you. It's going to increase the opportunity for you to have, in this case, more returning daily users. That's huge. That little increase in numbers can mean you have lifetime customers using your product for some sort of fee. They take out the MasterCard, they put in the numbers, and they're paying for your product. It's a small increase, but just fairly simply, if you do it right through UX, that can mean a lot in terms of revenue. And also brand awareness and user satisfaction. And there's a lot of things. Tying that to the aha moment, or continuing on with the aha moment and tying that into your commercial strategy, there is something to be said about exactly when you're asking for them to actually get out the credit card. So what we usually recommend startups, especially, no matter their product, typically, we want you to offer it for free. Because initially, we just want people, if the product is done right, if the experience is great, we just want them to experience what you're offering. Because obviously, you're offering something of value. That's why you started the company. That's why you're building this piece of software. We want the user and the potential customers to see that as soon as possible. We don't want any hinderings. We don't want anything blocking them from accessing this. Having to call a key account manager, having to sign up for a demo. We don't want that. We want them to sign up on your landing page, and we want them to start using the product. Maybe not to the fullest extent. And that's where the aha moment, and you figure out, where is it? Can we give it to them in some way? Maybe not 100%, maybe 80%. And then once we trigger that aha moment, we want to communicate that subscription. We want to communicate that upsell. And that can come in many different ways, but very typically that could be that once we've gotten the aha moment, we limit some sort of feature that is maybe, in the budgeting example, exporting your numbers, exporting that to PDF. If you want to do that, and that might not be everybody, but if you want to do that, we need 60 kronas a month, for example. And we made that process as easy as possible to sign up for your product. That needs to be really easy, and that needs to be done on their own too. So a good revenue booster is figuring out the aha moment, and then how can we tie that to your commercial strategy? How can we tie that to your pricing structure? How can we tie that to that trigger that converts them into a paying user? It's very tricky to get right, but it's very, very important. Last thing I want to mention in terms of these three areas that we find very important and that we focus a lot on is this infamous MVP concept. And I think we're all aware of the MVP, and we're all striving to build some sort of MVP. But generally speaking, the real, I think at least the original meaning of MVP has kind of been warped and misused a bit. At least that's what we hear too, and we experience in general, is that the intention of an MVP is to build something as quick as possible, focus on developing something, and then getting it out to your users to validate, is this the right thing to build? Is this solving the issues we want to solve? If that's the case, we throw it in the garbage and we build the right thing, essentially. If it wasn't the right thing, we didn't spend too much time and effort, essentially. We build as little as possible, as quick as possible. That's the general feel for an MVP. What usually ends up happening is you build the MVP, you might spend a bit longer than intended, a few more months, maybe half a year, and you might build one function or two features too many because you're looking at your competitors, you're listening to people that might not actually be your end customer, and you're building a bunch of features that you believe is the right thing to build. Now, these things, because it still needs to be fast, usually get built in isolation. So let's say you have two developers and they're working very hard and they're doing a very good job of building something very fast. The general user experience is not going to be connected the way you want to. So the experience is not going to be intuitive, it's not going to be nice. It's probably not going to be good looking too, which is also parameters you need to consider. It's not the most important thing, but it's certainly a thing you need to consider when you're building some sort of software today, because most people have some sort of sense of what is quality, what should it look like, what should it feel like. Going back to some of the principles I just talked about and mentioned, the 7 principles, these things are just, it's in our mind. So that's usually what ends up happening, that you just keep on building this MVP, which then becomes your 1.0. That has a lot of negative effects that I can talk about forever. But one of the things I like to highlight typically is that if you then at some point want to hire in more developers, and we've heard this a few times, it's anecdotal obviously, but it makes a lot of sense. You then hire in more developers to kind of continuously build on this product. They see the code base, they're not familiar with it. It's very difficult to onboard them because the code base is made in isolation, 2 developers who did a very good job isolated, but then adding a 3rd developer to the mix can be very difficult for that person, no matter the seniority. And typically, they're not going to have a great time. It's going to be difficult for you to retain that developer as an employee because it's just not a nice work environment. So you'll probably have to redo some work, and that might be the very first suggestion he or she makes, to redo the front end. Or that's at least what we typically hear too when we come in and design something, because then we start, the ball starts rolling and we start redoing everything anyway, which is not nice. It's a waste of resources, essentially, in most cases. What we typically want to recommend, and what we talk about quite a bit too, is the MLP, which is lovable instead of viable. Now, there's a lot of acronyms for this. We hear a lot of different ones, but essentially, and this is visually compared, a bit, well, take it with a grain of salt, but the essence is essentially that the MLP focuses a bit more on everything else. So functionality is obviously still big part of it. It's necessary, but we might build a little less. We might not build all the features that we think is needed. We might just build 20%. We might just start with one key feature that is the thing that we know there is a need for, because we're also validated. We have design and usability is part of it. So we've probably had some sort of, maybe that's you as a founder or a UXer, to do some initial research with the end customer. Kind of figured out, what are we building? What kind of feature set do we need? What do we do to not make this thing bloated from the get-go? We also put a bit of effort into the visuals, how it looks, how it feels, the 7 principles, good UX, and that is obviously going to take some time. So the downside of an MLP, because everything is not great, is that it's going to take longer. You getting from nothing to a 1.0 is going to take longer, and you just have to be aware of that. But that's fine. If you're in a saturated market where there's a lot of competition, you having an MLP compared to an MVP is going to set you apart. It's going to give you a competitive advantage, because, as I said initially, a lot of your competitors in this market have maybe had a nice ride so far, not too much competition, but they're probably not focused as heavily and as intelligently as you on getting the product, the intuitiveness, the feel, the onboarding, all these things around the core functionality that you're selling right. So you have an edge to begin with. MLP usually also cost a bit more. So it's a greater investment initially. There's obviously a greater investment and more resources that goes into having a designer, having a developer, and maybe even having a few extra hands to build this MLP initially, compared to an MVP where it might just be you and a developer just banging away at a version 1.0. But be mindful of this. Not everything applies to everyone. MVP is great if you're also entering a market where you don't have a lot of competitors, if you want to quickly get something out and try it out. So it's not to say either or is the most correct, but what we typically experience is the MLP mindset and approach is typically very great for startups, tech startups nowadays. Finally, I want to mention user feedback. I have to. It's very important. Generally speaking, as I said initially too, when we talk about user feedback, that can be just picking up the phone and calling your customers. That's very nice. That gives you some sort of idea. But what we typically recommend is you taking it a bit more serious. You put some effort and time into actually orchestrating a proper process. It doesn't have to take a long time. It doesn't have to cost a lot. It's just you want to make sure that you touch base with multiple customers. You want to hear what they need, and you don't just want to hear what they need and do what they say. You want to figure out if there's some sort of solution in between that kind of benefits more people. So the idea of building something for one particular company or client, customer, is usually not the ideal way to go. That might work very well in enterprise. You might need to for cash flow reasons, but essentially what we want to do is find the best solution for the most people. And UX research in general is great for that. I have some more numbers to finish this off, but we have some sort of baseline, which is the bottom part, which is what this is visualizing essentially what focusing on UX research can do for you as a company, what it can add on top of what you already have. So let's say you have a functioning product and it's great, it's fine. Applying UX research, focusing on UX research will give you some added bonuses. And that's essentially what I want to focus on here is we're looking at increased customer satisfaction, which obviously makes sense. It might not be 58%, but it's going to give you some sort of return of investment in terms of customer satisfaction because you're actually listening to your customers. You're asking them, you're involving them. And customers generally like that, especially if they're using your product for everyday work or it's a business critical tool for them, which most of the software that we're working on usually is. So customer satisfaction means a lot because it helps retaining the users, the companies, as we said previously, which also means that you get more out of them as they're on the platform, lifetime value, which is great. Moving on to the retention part, again, goes hand in hand with customer satisfaction, but creating this loyal fan base of users and companies, these ambassadors, as we call them, obviously also plays into the customer retention part. Because if you feel like you have a say and if you feel like you can help pivot or build this product in a direction that helps you, that's obviously something that you would pay a lot of money for, and it's not something you're just going to switch out from day to day. Active users is not relevant for all companies building products. Some are not necessarily eager to have active users, depending on what you're building. But nonetheless, active users, because of the cascading effect of the two other ones, is obviously going to have an effect too. So active users in the sense that we might have more people using the product because it's great and it's solving something, because we know exactly what we want to solve, and the product is solving that exactly. That's going to create more people coming back, returning daily. But also, because you're building a great product, people switch jobs. They take the software with them when they get into a new job. They say, oh, we use this HR system, we use this ESG platform. In my previous job, it was very great. Let's get that in there. So it also becomes UX, this marketing and sales machine for you because you've focused on making a product and experience that just works very well. And that is, believe it or not hard to come by today, but it is sometimes a bit undervalued because everything needs to be quick, everything needs to be speedy. So finding that product that just works, it's reliable, it's well designed, feels like quality, is something that you shouldn't undermine. You should be mindful of that fact in your general product building. Because when we talk about user feedback too, one thing is, of course, talking to your existing users, but something that's way more interesting to me, at least, is talking to the people who came into your landing page, who signed up, created an account, started using the product somehow, somewhat, to some extent, and then before becoming a daily user or maybe paying for the product, they leave. Like finding those people, talking to those people, figuring out why is that exactly, that is extremely valuable. That's a source of valuable user feedback that is, I would argue, way more valuable for you as a startup founder, or generally speaking as a startup team, than just speaking to people who are happy already. Happy people tend to not focus too much on the bad things, and that's not really, it's nice to hear the good things, but it's not really going to drive your product forward. The people who leave, especially people who thought they needed this product or was willing to spend some time signing up and trying it out, those are the interesting people to talk to, because that's where the real value is. That's it. We have a Q&A session here at the end, if there's anything on the live streams. If not, I hope they gave you some sort of sense, made you somewhat mindful of UX. There's a lot to talk about in this topic, but I think I've highlighted some of the things that I think are most important, especially here initially as a startup or as a growth company. If you haven't looked at it yet, even for established companies, figuring out your customer journey, figuring out the aha moment, figuring out where and when to focus on the commercial aspect, your commercial strategy of getting people signed up and hooked, and then just thinking a bit about speed versus quality.
Okay, so Christian is here. He said hello, sorry for being late earlier. So that's nice. He also says that it's very true what you just said, but however, the interesting people do not return his calls or emails. So maybe if you have any tips on that, or
The interesting people doesn't return his emails and calls?
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
well, I'm sad to hear that first.
Journey.
Yeah, that's another journey. Well, that clearly depends on Christian's context, obviously. If it sounds like a sales process, I imagine. I know if it's the Christian I know he's building a software product, SaaS solution, for learning. And maybe if Christian is still here, he can add a few more words to it. But I imagine it's outside of the customer journey, like in terms of the product experience. But if it's inside, like if they've joined and started using it and then just disappears and ghosts him, then obviously there is something to be talked about there. But maybe he can add a few more words if he's still here.
Yeah. We also have Stephanie who wonders, have a question regarding the long-term impact of UX. So how can good UX create lasting value for a product, not just quick wins?
That's a great question. Hard question. There's a lot to cover in that question. Long-lasting impact. Well, I think, speaking of sales and marketing, I think it's interesting to look at UX, especially from the happier users perspective, as we're talking about today. I think it's very interesting to see the effect that good UX, a good user experience, as I said here at the end too, has an effect on people's mindset and the general perception of your brand, of your product. And that's a lasting impact. I remember products I used a long time ago. I might not use it anymore, but I remember them being well built, worked exactly how I wanted it to work, and it helped me do my job better. And that sticks with you. And you're able to recommend that. You're able to, as I said, maybe join another company who's not aware of the product that is in question and recommend that to senior management, or apply it yourself, implement it yourself in the organization. So lasting value, one thing is good brand awareness, a good brand perception, which also goes a bit beyond UX, touches a bit on the other disciplines like marketing.
Great. Okay, so we got a few more words from Christian here. He said that it's mostly like people who start with a free trial and gets through the onboarding, but then nothing happens after that.
Oh, that is interesting. Let me go back to the journey here. So, well, I can just restate some of the things I talked about, but I'm sure Christian knows his aha moment in the journey. But if I just had to speculate, because I haven't tried the product fully, but I have a general idea of what it does. So onboarding, obviously, I imagine, and Christian can correct me if I'm wrong, that I can sign up on the website. Maybe I have to call Christian, one of his colleagues, to get an account, but I imagine I can sign up on my own. If that's not the case, that's a different story, but let's imagine that. So I sign up on my own for this platform, which is a learning tool where I can upload videos. I can talk about how to use Teams at EDL, and that will be something that my colleagues would look at and try to get through and learn how to do properly. Now, the aha moment, I imagine, comes at a point where I am in some sort of dashboard, on some sort of homepage, where I upload my content and write a description, maybe write out some questions if that's part of it too, but make this little quiz based on some video material. Now, that could be a very time-consuming and difficult task. Can't speak to the actual experience in Christian software, but I can imagine that being very time, and you need to be mentally ready. So after onboarding, you need to be mentally ready to start producing or adding content. And if you don't have the content ready, that's obviously going to be a blocker for you to get the aha moment, because I imagine the aha moment is you easily creating something, having it out there and sharing it internally or with external people. That could be one thing. So kind of figuring out how can we guide the user, how can we help the user to create their first course, let's say, first quiz, their first video material easily in the platform. Maybe ask who they are, and we've spoken about this before too. Initially in the onboarding, ask what kind of role they have. If they're a CEO, if they're a marketing, if they're somebody else, IT, then maybe pre-make a few templates that's easy to use. I'm sure they're already doing that too, but once you get into the platform, you already have some sort of material. You can test it out. You can figure out the aha moment through content that's already created to see, okay, this is great. But figuring out that aha moment, I'm not sure what it is in his case, but figuring that out and then moving it forward, because typically they wouldn't just disappear once they've figured out that this is the right thing, I imagine. Because I don't think that it's an issue with pricing structure. I don't think it's an issue with some of the other underlying issues that we sometimes see in startups. He can add more words to it if I'm off on something, so we can pinpoint it and get to the solution. But
yeah, he said that you were correct with that you can sign up and go through the initial product features.
Okay. That you can.
Yeah, that you can do that.
Nice. That's good.
Yeah. Hopefully that gave him some help.
He knows where to find me in case that's.
Yeah, exactly. We also got another question from Dario here. He would love your opinion on what's in your view, what's the best way to show doubters that UX really matters?
Oh, well, it depends on the first of all, very good question, Dario. It depends on, I would say, the context, like who the doubter is, like what role they have. If it's your boss in the place you're working at, then I would probably approach it differently. If it's your colleague, then I think no matter what, actually, I would just try and do something. Like do some UX related stuff, and that could be initially, if you never focused on it, pick up the phone, call a few customers, and figure out what they're saying. Compile a PowerPoint with quotes, testimonials from existing customers, and figure out what are they saying, pinpointing exactly what kind of issues they have. Maybe even pinpointing it on something like what I'm showing here, which is this funnel, figuring out, okay, we hear a lot of people like Birgitte or Michael are having issues here at the account creation flow, or usually it would be somewhere in the product, obviously. But figure that out and present that to your colleagues, present that to the developers, present that to your boss, to kind of show that one, you're putting in some effort, but most importantly two, that there are some issues here that we're not focusing on, that we're not talking about. And I've spent maybe 2 hours of my time reaching out, figuring out where are some pain points that we can potentially fix, maybe quite easily, and maybe not very easily. It depends. But presenting that, at least in my experience early on in my career too, that will quickly give you some respect, and also give UX some respect in terms of, oh, is that easy? Like getting that sort of feedback that can actually be applied to your product maybe tomorrow, and then get more user satisfaction. That's anybody would want that, I imagine.
Nice. Thank you, Dario. We have another question here from Mads, who says, it's very interesting. This seems somewhat B2C minded. Do you have any insights into approaching this for B2B, which is sometimes known for completely disregarding UX from the beginning?
Yes. Well, most of the work we do is B2B. There is a lot of good things to learn from B2C, because they're typically very focused on obviously making it as easy as possible, because people's time is very, let me get back to one of the Lunar examples here. People's time are obviously very expensive and difficult to garner if you have multiple solutions as a consumer. But I think, as I mentioned, Luna and Pleo, which is obviously B2B. Luna has, of course, B2C qualities, and I think that's where they started too. But now they're also offering B2B stuff in terms of me as a company being able to sign up and create an account. Now, Pleo, I think maybe is the best example in this case, and it's going to sound stupid, but it's just doing it, like focusing, actually putting in some effort in terms of separating yourself from the rest, because especially in enterprise, you have a huge advantage. We have a lot of good cases where we're looking at a market, for example, in property management, which is historically extremely boring and unsexy, and the solutions are not very great. Sure, they have a lot of functionality, but at this point, probably maybe not even to the extent that you need. So you have a huge advantage through UX as an enterprise, or at least building something for enterprise to stand out. And I think standing out is obviously one thing, and that should ultimately at some point lead to some sort of brand awareness or sales, essentially. But onboarding in this case might not be the most important thing, but just getting all the fundamentals right in your platform when you're out demoing it, because that's usually how that happens, no? In terms of enterprise tools, you have a key account manager who goes out and presents your software, does a demo of it. Presenting yourself already on the landing page is something different. I think we've had good experience with that. Just the visuals, taking a look at some of the more Pleo is also a good example of that, but taking a look outside of Denmark and kind of focusing on how are big American internet companies, how they're presenting themselves, successful ones, in a very nice and modern way. So already from the landing page, we get the sense that, okay, these guys are different, and the functionality is somewhat there, maybe not completely, but I'm interested, I'm intrigued, and getting that sense of what the product is and why it's different initially, and then getting into the user experiences, then just being hardcore about getting the principles right. 7 principles is a good way to start, making sure that it's performant. I think that's maybe one of the biggest differentiators, which is more of a technical thing. But obviously, if the platform is slow, or it takes a long time to present data or load the solution, which we see a lot in enterprise because they're really bloated or they were made a long time ago, that's a differentiator that has an association with UX, because that's obviously the user experience too. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to enterprise. But yes, there is a tendency to think that mediocrity is fine, and that is great for you if you're mindful of it, if you're spending some time and investing some energy into making sure that your product is not mediocre, which is honestly in most cases quite easily done, easily achieved, if you're just mindful of the user journey and involving your users, or potential users in this enterprise endeavor. I think. I hope that gives some sort of context to it.
We got one question from Modestus here, who wonders, how can we navigate the balance between functionality and great user experience when building an NLP? Is it something that can be pulled off without proper UX research?
Well, depending on, as I mentioned, a lot of things happen through gut feeling, like experience, and experience is obviously hard to come by. That's something that you need to acquire over time. But the reality is that even though the teaching books might not tell that tale, is that UX research is, first of all, very unappreciated and not heavily invested into, but it's also something that usually get sidestepped and gut feeling kind of takes over. And that might come from very experienced C-level who worked at a big company and now wanted to do their own thing and focus and like do it better. There's obviously a lot of experience, there's a lot of gut feeling that we can go on to build something that feels like an MLP, definitely. And to some degree, starting out that way also works. We do that all the time because sometimes there's just not time or budget or the right focus, even though we might scream it all the time. That is very important. But I think to Modestus's question, you can you cannot build an MLP without the user involvement, like completely. But I also think that why would you? Like it's so easy to just do it. The activity in itself obviously is not easy. It requires somebody experienced to do this and facilitate it. But just doing it and taking time to, if you're building your startup now and you're focused on this MLP approach, find the right people. It might be your previous colleagues if you again left your steady job to build a tech startup, which a lot of times happen. Find the right people to talk to, figure out what this is kind of what we have in mind building, maybe make a little prototype, which again, it's not very time consuming or expensive. Have an experienced designer or UXer make this mock-up and this prototype in a matter of days, take that on the road and then get some validation initially. It's a no-brainer. It's so easy. So I think you just have to do that part, like to really achieve that MLP, and it doesn't require a whole lot. If you're not willing to put that effort in, and that might make sense in some instances, so you get like a weird hybrid between MVP and MLP, that's probably okay sometimes. But the risk you're running, of course, can be very expensive, and it can be effort and time you could have spent elsewhere, which is the most daunting thing for me, at least, to hear all these terrible stories of building 100% of something where 20% was needed, and maybe the next 20% was something else. So balancing that without user involvement is I want to say it's not the right approach. Because it's so easy. Do it.
Nice. So thank you for your questions so far. I think we have Christian says, thanks, Frederick. Have another meeting.
Bye, Christian.
Yes. Feel free to drop by Tuesday. Yeah.
All right. Open invitation.
Yeah.
Should we wrap it up?
Yes.
People know where to reach us if they have more questions.
Yes.
After the fact.
Yeah.
Cool. Cool. Thank you guys so much. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you for joining. You're up here. Yes. Bye.